Thank you for your presence here. Javier Domocos Rios, the Consul General of Cuba in Toronto, as well as Susana Merca Benitez, also Consul from Cuba in Toronto, and also the representative from the Bolivarian Revolution in Toronto. And very happy to guest. It's an honor, of course, to be in the same panel with Dr. Keith Ellis, who I've known I don't know how many years. It doesn't go back to 19th century Cuba, but it goes back quite a while. I've been asked to talk on the Cuba's approach to democracy and Cuba-U.S. relations. In fact, in my view, the two have nothing to do with each other. Cuba's approach to democracy and the Cuba-U.S. relations and negotiations have nothing to do with each other, in the sense that Cuba is a sovereign, independent state. It has every right, as any other country in the world, to develop and work on its own approach to democracy, irrespective of what anyone else says, including the United States. At the same time, we know that friends of Cuba here or elsewhere want to know more about this democracy in Cuba, Cuba's approach to democracy, so that they can better deal with it when they're speaking to other people who are not that familiar with Cuba, who may not be friends of Cuba, who may just be curious about Cuba's political system. So we have to be able, in my view, we have to be able to deal with the question of Cuba's approach to democracy. Anything I was saying is analyzed and documented in detail in the book that I have here. When Obama gave his talk on December 17th and made announced the very important and positive decision to establish the discussion with Cuba to normalize relations, especially to establish diplomatic relations in their respective countries, as well as, very importantly, release the remaining three of the Cuban fives who were in U.S. prison and send them back home. I remember when I saw that in the news that day, I think was one of the happiest days of my life. A surprise, but a very happy day, given the decision of Obama, which has to be seen in a positive light. At the same time, I read very carefully, having written my book based on reading in detail all the documents and the original declarations of Cuba, of the United States and other countries. In his speech on December 17th, he mentioned democracy in relation to Cuba 4 times. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times democracy in relation to Cuba, of course in a negative sense. He also mentioned American values or our values several times, maybe 5, 6, 7 times. And he said specifically in that December 17th speech, we want to help Cubans help themselves, and we want the Cubans to be empowered to live with dignity and self-determination. So let us look at this issue of what is Cuba's approach to democracy. Firstly, I would say a good argument for us to give to friends and foes alike with regards to democracy in Cuba is that, in my view, in any case, Cuba's approach, Cuba's road to democracy began in the 19th century, in 1868, when they began those wars of independence against Spain from 1868 to 1898, some of the features of which were just presented by Dr. Keith Ellis. Now, in that period, 1868, 1898, something we never hear about, that the Cubans in the liberated territories, right under the nose of the Spanish, the biggest Spanish army in all of the Americas, they had 4 constituent assemblies whose delegates were elected in the liberated areas to be members of these constituent assemblies, and these constituent assemblies actually deliberated upon and worked out constitutions based on the input from the delegates as well as from the people in the surrounding area. In addition, when the war started in 1868, one of its main features that the leader at the time, the Cespedes, he was a owner of a sugar plantation and also the owner of slaves, as all of the other similar people in similar situations. But what he said at the time, he told his slaves, if you want to, you can be free right now, and if you like, you can join us in the struggle against Spain. So here we have an example to the United States of the Cuban people liberating themselves, empowering themselves, starting from 1868 to 1898 through these constitutions and the struggle against Spain. And as mentioned by Dr. Keith Ellis, this war was virtually won against Spain when the United States walked in and stole the victory from Cuba and established their hegemony over Cuba, which basically lasted from the end of 1898 till 1958. I would also argue to people that Cuba's path to democracy, Cuba's approach to democracy, started once again in the 1950s, when we know that the revolution under the leadership of Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro, Che Guevara, and others, they liberated areas in 1958 in the Sierra Maestra. They're actually states within the context of a American colonial rule over Cuba. And in these liberated areas, they had organized health, they organized education. For example, there was even an agrarian law that was established at the time in order to provide land to the peasants who tilled the land at the time. So you had the emerging of a new state. That, I would say, is another example of how Cuba's approach to democracy has its roots in the very beginnings of the revolution in the 19th century, as well as in 1958, 1959. Now, what happened in 1959? The revolution finally succeeded, but were there elections? How did the decision to not hold elections right away take place? This I deal with in my book in a very graphic way. Some people have said it's almost like watching a video clip as if you were there in 1959, 1960. Fidel Castro actually held meetings with millions of people, for example, in plazas, in squares, in which the issue of having elections at that time, in 1959, 1960, was raised. And the people said spontaneously, no, we don't want elections. Was it because that the Cubans were inherently anti-democratic against elections? No, because the only experience they had with elections were the ones imposed by the United States from 1901 to 1958, which they basically alternated with different parties in power, different strongmen in power, different personalities in power. When one was discredited, it would have someone else coming to power from 1901, 1958. So the Cubans said spontaneously for the masses, they say that, look, we are accomplishing things now in the Cuban Revolution. We have the literacy campaign going. We have agrarian reform going on. We have nationalizations of industries in the cities, giving housing to the people who before had to pay exorbitant amounts. This is going on. Why should we paralyze all these great achievements now by getting involved in elections? We don't need that now. So that went on from 1959 to 1974, when the Cubans realized we have to have a more structured government with elections. And they did work out several things. One, of course, was they worked out a draft constitution. This draft constitution, worked out in 1974, 1975, was sent to the people. And the people in all the work centers, educational institutions, neighborhoods, they discussed the draft constitution and came back with tens of thousands of suggestions to amend it and to change it. And this was finally, these changes were taken into account. A new draft of the Constitution was set up, and it was sent to the people once again in a referendum in 1976. And 97% of the people voted in that referendum, and of those more than 97% who voted, over 97% voted in favor of the referendum. So once again, another constitution established by the Cuban people themselves. I mean, talk about empowering themselves. That was what they were doing again in 1976, as they have that heritage going back to the 19th centuries, when even under the Spanish, they organized constituent assemblies and constitutions. While going back in the 19th century, while the Cubans had these constituent assemblies and these new constitutions voted upon by the people, the United States still had at that time in the 18th century, and they still have now, that old Constitution of the United States, which was elaborated in closed doors by a small circle of white, wealthy, slave-owning leaders. That's how the American Constitution came about. It's the same American Constitution that is in place today. And so with the new structures for government and election in 1976, the Cuban people start to organize elections. There's been changes since then, even though it cannot be done in a few minutes, is to explain very briefly how democracy in Cuba operates. Firstly, before we get into the obvious one that comes into the mind, how elections take place, how the National Assembly operates, how the Municipal Assembly operates, I would like to say that the institution and the individuals who are supposed to be the antithesis of democracy, that is, Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro, and the Communist Party of Cuba, in fact, it are these individuals and this institution, the Communist Party of Cuba, which was really in the forefront of promoting democracy in Cuba. For example, the referendum in 1976, in which people decided to take things into their own hands with their own constitution. For example, the improvement to the electoral law in 1991, 1992. Now, what happened is that Cuba was faced with a lot of serious difficulties. And in 2007, Raúl Castro organized a meeting in Camagüey in 2007. It was a regular mass meeting in which he said, we have many problems facing us, economic and social problems. Let us put the cards on the table, and people will have the right in the community, in the neighborhoods, to present their views on what the problems are and what they think the solutions will be. Everyone in Cuba, literally the whole country, took part in these debates. These were all tabulated, taken into account, and brought to the higher levels of the government in 2007. And it's based on this. People here are probably familiar that there was important guidelines that were established at the Party Congress in 2011 with regards to changes in the economy, in the society, etc. Many of these points came from the grassroots in these meetings that took place after 2007 and 2010 that were brought up. For example, we see a lot in the press, they talk about, now Cubans have the right to buy and sell their cars, they now have the right to fully buy and sell housing and renovate their housing and all that. But these points, to give you two examples, these points actually came from the grassroots and were funneled up to the higher levels and were included into the new guidelines when they were finally approved in 2011. So these are just one or two examples of how the Communist Party of Cuba actually promotes and initiates and encourages what I call participatory democracy, that people participate in their own political system. Now, how do elections take place? In Cuba, now I'm going to present you a scheme of how elections take place, but I don't want to give the impression either that everything is perfect, that there are no problems, there are no weaknesses. Yes, they are. For example, nomination meetings take place in the following way. People in the local areas, for example, that a meeting could be this size, of neighbors only, have a right to propose someone from amongst their neighbors to be a candidate to run for elections as delegate to the Municipal Assembly. Once the people propose this way, other meetings take place, and between 2 and 8 candidates can be selected or nominated to run as candidates for the Municipal Assembly. Elections take place. How does it take place? Very simple. The local electoral officials take the photograph and the short biography of each of the candidates. They are posted in places that are easy to see, such as public offices, schools, markets, etc. And then people on their own, just going about their daily lives, can see these posters, this information, and make a conscious decision on their own who to vote for when elections take place. And elections take place, and I have witnessed them myself on several occasions. They're actually public. Anyone can go and witness these elections. They are held secret elections. Everyone 16 years and older has a right to vote. And when people go into the closed booth, you have a right to vote for one of the 2 to 8 candidates that are on, but they're not involved at all. The Communist Party of Cuba does not propose candidates. When, for example, here, as giving ourselves an example, as a group of neighborhoods, when someone wants to propose someone to be a candidate, the person cannot say, I'm proposing such person as a candidate because he's a member of the Communist Party of Cuba. What they do say, this is what I've witnessed myself on many occasions, they say, I am proposing such and such person because the person is active in the neighborhood, the person is active in their place of work, the person has a good character, and this is why I'm proposing that the person should be a candidate to run for election to the Municipal Assembly. The Communist Party, yes, I've seen their presence there, but they are only there to help assure that the elections take place according to the Constitution, according to the electoral rules, but they themselves do not take part in the elections. There is no money at all involved in elections. This is completely different than the American system. We all know about it. There's no need to discuss it. But for someone to run for elections, there's no need for 1 cent. The only expenses are taken up by the state, where they produce a biography and the photographs of the candidate. The municipal assembly, once they are elected in that way, they form the municipal assembly, and then they vote to have for the president and the vice president of the assembly, which would be the equivalent of our mayor and mayors, but they really must respond to the municipal assembly. And regarding the National Assembly, it's quite different. The nominations take place through the work of candidacy commissions. Candidacy commissions are formed of the mass organizations, and they propose people to be elected to National Assembly as deputies. The situation is different there. There's not a multi-choice possibility of voting for two or more candidates. There's only one candidate on the ballot. But that's a very complicated thing, and it requires lots of discussion, which I deal with in detail in my book. People have varying views on this whole situation. Now, once, for example, the National Assembly is established, sometimes it's said that, that Old Castro isn't elected. Excuse me. First of all, in order to be elected to the deputy, as a deputy, he was elected in his local area. And then the Council of State and the President of the Council of State, which is the position that Old Castro holds at this time, they are elected within the National Assembly in a secret ballot vote. And in this way, the Council of State and its President is elected. The National Assembly plays a very active role with regards to legislation. When legislation is needed and necessary and is known to have wide popular approval, they adopt it as a decree law. For example, decree laws with regards to the self-employed, the local self-employed, which you'd like to call them businesses. This was carried out through a decree law. Because it was very popular, there was no controversy about it. Everyone wanted it. Firstly, the people who were involved in this type of self-employed activity, some of it illegal at the time, they wanted to do it legally, and they wanted to be expanded as well. And the people on their own who they themselves were not interested in becoming self-employed workers, they were interested in having better services. For example, regarding restaurants, regarding food, with regards to transportation, etc. And so they also wanted this type of legislation to be adopted, and it was adopted. However, when there is legislation that is controversial, for example, in Cuba, like any other country in the world, there's a problem with regards to age and pensions. And so the costs of pensions have been going up a lot in Cuba. The people who are eligible for pensions, this was going up as well. It was increasing. It created an important drain against the Cuban economy. And so they had to adopt a new social security law. So unlike a country such as Canada, when they have a new law such as this, you just, it's just ordered. The only time you find out about it, like when I found out about it, you get something in the mail saying that the Social Security has been changed and it works in such and such a way. In Cuba, that's not how it happened. They worked out a draft bill on the Social Security legislation, and it was sent to people to be discussed in all the workplaces across the country, in the neighborhoods and educational institutions. So people can have their input and make some important changes or amendments to that legislation. And this is what happened. The legislation was finally adopted, but after having been discussed amongst the people in different areas. At one point I was following this Social Security law as sort of my case study and how legislation takes place in Cuba, to be outlined in my book. And I followed all of these local discussions that took place where the input of the people was taken into account. And then the revised draft of the bill came to the National Assembly. So I figured at that time, and I had the honor and the privilege, I guess you would say, to attend the working commissions of the National Assembly that were responsible for establishing the new legislation on Social Security. So I figured, well, this would just be a formality coming to these working conditions. But no, this is not what happened. When it was presented there, I saw deputies raising their hands, making suggestions for other changes, other improvements, other amendments to the legislation before it was worked out finally and before it was presented to the Parliament, where it was voted, discussed, and finally adopted. I would say there are two main features of Cuban democracy. One is the basic way that I outlined how it operates, which strives to involve the people based on the tradition that goes all the way back to the 19th century. Involve the people in through their own participation in their own political system. But part of the important feature of participatory democracy in Cuba now is that the Cuban social scientists, deputies, and researchers are carrying out very serious debate on how to improve last week political process. Grandma, the Communist Party newspaper, came out, it's published, and it said that they are now working, amongst other things, on a new electoral law that is going to be presented perhaps when the next Congress takes place in 2016. So here we are. Cuba is not a fixed, structured democracy that everything is hunky-dory, everything is okay. The most serious critics of the Cuban political system, the electoral system, and how to improve it comes from the Cubans themselves. But when I talk about Cubans themselves, it's the Cubans with whom I hang out with. That is, Cubans who are revolutionary. Most of them are members of the Communist Party, some are not, but everyone is in favor of improving the political system while maintaining its complete sovereignty, independence, based on the self-determination of the Cuban people. It has nothing to do with what you hear from time to time that comes out in the newspapers outside of Cuba with regard such and such dissident are complaining about no freedom of speech in Cuba or the elections are not fair and all that. I'm not talking about that. There is no dearth. Of course, you don't see it because the mainstream media in Canada does not give attention to these social scientists, these delegates, these political activists in Cuba who are in favor of making improvements. At the same time, they are also in favor of maintaining the basic political system that was established in 1976 and that has been reaffirmed on several occasions. So on that, I don't want to deal with it any longer. You could just, I'll have to plug my book once again. Everything I say, everything, it's all in my book. When I did my first book launch in Ottawa about a year and a half ago, someone raised their hand and asked a question. I just want something, democracy, Cuban Democracy 101. What is it? Well, Cuban Democracy 101 is this. What can I tell you? It's the whole book. My first book was done in November, December 2013. I was putting finishing touches to it. And 2013. And then Hugo Chavez died after that. And the whole situation in Venezuela has been changing drastically since then. So my chapter in Venezuela, in the Spanish version of the book, has been updated to take this into account. And so, I'd just like to let you know that these books are available. I hope you don't mind. As I mentioned, I came all the way from Montreal. I want to make sure that people have the opportunity, if they're interested, buying the book in Spanish or English. I'd like to close on one important issue. I started by saying that Cuba-U.S. relationships are going on, the negotiations are going on. I think it's important. I personally would like to congratulate the leadership of Cuba, and specifically the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Bruno Rodriguez, Josefina Vidal, the Cuban Embassy in Ottawa, the Cuban Consulate in Toronto, for the great work that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is doing. A very, very complicated situation. Negotiating with the United States, who has for all these decades has refused to recognize Cuba, and now they're able to do it with courage, conviction, and I will repeat something similar to what Keith Ellis said. Don't worry, the Cubans have been in this diplomacy business since 1959. They know who they're dealing with. They know very well the United States is just changing tactics. And while their overall objective is the same, they're very aware of it. As Raul Castro mentioned very clearly on several occasions recently, we are not giving in on the principles.
That is important. We're willing to discuss tactics. He even said if the United States wants to discuss democracy in Cuba or elections in Cuba, fine, let us discuss it. But also, let us also discuss democracy in the United States and elections in the United States. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that you found this helpful. Thank you.